about the constructor. This is the continuation part of the constructor. Today we will discuss about the types of constructor. First we will discuss, after that we will implement types of constructor. First one is default constructor. Default constructor, or that is also known as parameterless constructor. Second one, parameterized constructor. Parameterized constructor. Third one is copy constructor. And fourth one is static constructor. What does it mean by constructor? In previous video we already seen that constructor is the special method of a class. Okay, constructor is a special type of method of a class. If the constructor is not defined by the programmer explicitly, then on behalf of the programmer, the constructor is created by the compiler. But compiler will create the constructor that is default constructor or parameterless constructor, and that is by default public. Okay, if the compiler creates the constructor, then that constructor will always default constructor or parameterless constructor, and that constructor is by default public. Okay, but programmer can define parameterless constructor, parameterized constructor, copy constructor. Every type of constructor by the programmer can define. But if the programmer doesn't define any constructor in the class, then on behalf of the programmer, compiler define a default constructor. Okay, why constructor defined by the compiler? Because if without constructor, without constructor in a class, if there is no constructor in a class, then that class instance cannot be created. That class variable cannot initialize. That class cannot instantiate, and memory for the variables can't be created, initialized. Okay, that is why if the programmer doesn't define a constructor, then on behalf of the programmer, constructor automatically defined, but compiler define default constructor. Default constructor is parameter less constructor. There is no parameter. Okay, why the compiler define default constructor parameterless constructor? Because the compiler define parameterless constructor because the compiler don't know what type of parameter we need to pass. That is the reason constructor define default constructor. Okay, parameterless constructor. How the compiler know what type of the value we want to pass? That is the reason. Okay. Suppose we have a class test, and in this test class, if we don't define any constructor, then compiler define this parameterless constructor. If you don't, if you only create the class, if you only define the class with some variables and methods, but doesn't define any constructor in this, then on behalf of programmer, the compiler by default create this, define this constructor. That is done by the compiler. That is implicit constructor. Okay. If the programmer doesn't define any constructor, then this is defined by the compiler. That is implicit constructor. We already in previous video we have already covered this. Okay, and the constructor is called explicitly. We will I will tell. Okay, means what is the need of constructor? The constructor is used when we instantiate the class, then constructor is called, and constructor is create the allocate the memory and initialize the data members are variable of a class. Okay, if the constructor there is no constructor in a class, then we can't instantiate or create object of a particular class. That's why constructor required. Constructor is used for initialization of the data members or variables of a particular class. This is default constructor, are also called as parameterless constructor, because here there is no parameter. That is why it's called as parameterless constructor also. Okay. If the programmer is defined any constructor, if the programmer is defined any constructor, either parameterized or parameterless constructor, any constructor, if the programmer defined explicitly, then the compiler doesn't define any constructor in a particular class. But if there is no constructor in a particular class, then by default compiler creates this default constructor. And what is the parameterized constructor? Parameterized constructor is same like that. Just suppose we have test 2. This is test 1 class. We just pass a parameter like int a. Okay, that is this is the parameterized constructor. We have a parameter. Okay, in a particular. The second definition is the constructor name is same as the class name. So the constructor name also test1. Okay, here test and test1. And this constructor is parameterized constructor because we have a parameter. Okay, and the parameterized constructor can't define by the compiler implicitly, because compiler doesn't know which type of parameter we need to pass. Okay, so parameterized constructor we need to explicitly define. If any constructor is defined, if that is parameterized, then that means that is defined by the programmer, because compiler can define only parameterless constructor or default constructor when there is no constructor in a particular class defined. Then Compiler can create the constructor, but only default constructor or parameterless constructor. But we have, suppose we have test1 class, and this test1 class is parameterized. This test1 class have parameterized constructor. The parameterized constructor, that means this constructor is defined by the programmer. Okay, why? Because parameterized constructor cannot create by the compiler. That is explicit constructor. Explicit constructor. Explicit constructor means that is created by the programmer. This is parameterized constructor. Okay. This is example one is parameterless constructor. This is parameterized constructor. Example two. This is example three. That is copy constructor. What is copy constructor? What does it mean by copy constructor? Suppose we want to create multiple instance of a class. Okay. Suppose we have a class test2. Okay. We have a class test2, and we have created the in this we have a variable I or x. Okay. And we want to create the same type of variable. We want to create multiple instance. We want to create a multiple instance of test2 class with the same values. With the same values, then in that case we use copy constructor. Okay, copy constructor is nothing, just a constructor with parameter public test2, like that we create. This is the constructor, and this constructor takes the value of this test2 type. What a test2 class is user defined uh, uh, data type. Class is just like a user defined data type. Class is used to create user defined data type. Here, test2 is a data type. Okay, customize class is used to create customized data type. Okay, so this is the test2 type, and we can pass test2 type instance here, and we will create here. We can use like this, use this dot x equal to x dot something, whatever the instance is passed in this x. According to that, we can pass in this instance variable. Okay. Example 4. What is the static constructor? Static constructor. When static constructor came into the picture, static constructor came into the picture. Suppose we have a class test3, and in test3, if there is in test3, if there is any static variable like static int act. If there is any static variable, then then static constructor came into the picture to initialize this static variable. A static constructor is used to initialize the static data members. Okay, and non-static constructor is used to initialize static and non-static data members both. Okay, but a static constructor is used to initialize static data members. Okay, suppose we have a class test 3, and in test 3 there is no constructor. Currently in test 3 there is no constructor defined here. Okay, only we have the static data member. Then by default, on behalf of the compiler, on behalf of the programmer, compiler creates static constructor like this, static constructor. On behalf of the programmer, compiler defines static constructor. Okay, and a static constructor is by default public. Okay, and a static constructor is also parameterless. Okay, because because why the static constructor is parameterless? Why the static constructor is parameterless? Because static constructor, we define the static, suppose we have the static data member, then a static constructor is defined by the compiler on behalf of the programmer. Okay, and suppose there is no data member, there is no data member, we can explicitly define the static constructor also. If there is no any data members of static, then we can use static modifier to define a static constructor. But static constructor is parameterless and by default public, because this is called by the uh, implicitly. This static constructor is called implicitly, means the programmer is not calling the static constructor explicitly. Okay, that is why this static constructor is parameterless constructor, and because of parameterless constructor, the static constructor cannot be overloaded. Okay, this is by default call, implicitly call. Okay, suppose we are calling explicitly, then we can pass the value in the constructor. Okay, but it is implicitly called, then we can't pass the parameter in this constructor, static constructor. This is implicitly called. Due to the implicit call, we cannot pass the value parameter in a constructor. That is why it is parameterless, and due to the parameterless, it cannot be overloaded. Okay, this is the parameter less constructor, and that is static constructor. Okay, and in static constructor is executed before the main is the entry point, but static constructor, static block is executed before the main. Just go to the entry point main, and after that it called a static constructor, and after that the pointer go to the main method. Okay. If the static class, if there is a static class, then every member of the class will be static. Okay. Means will be there will be some static constructor, static data members, all are the static. Okay. We can't place anything non-static. Means we can't use non-static constructor in the static class. Only static constructor, static data members, all are the static. Okay. Now we can see the example of this. First we will see, already have seen the example of the default constructor or parameter less constructor. This is the constructor demo, and this is the constructor. This is default constructor, or we can say parameter less constructor, because there is no parameter. Okay. And when we in the main method we just create the instance of the particular class, particular constructor demo class. Then what happens, this constructor is explicitly called. Means non-static constructor is explicitly called. This is a non-static constructor. Okay. And that is explicit, this constructor is explicitly called, and this method is executed. This method is executed. Okay. One time c1, when c1 is created first instance, then this is called c2, then again this is called, and when creates c3 in third instance, then again is called, three times called. Okay. Now we will see parameterized constructor. What does it mean by parameterized constructor? Okay. uh, Now we add another class, parameterized constructor demo. Uh, Constructor demo is the project name, and parameterized constructor demo. Now we need to create a constructor. Constructor. This is the parameterized example. So I have written a parameter I, and we need to just console dot write line parameterized right constructor is called. Okay. Adding the value of I. Okay. Public static void main. Public static void main. Create the instance of the particular class. T equal to new demo. Just pass 20. Now what happened? In the main method, we just created the instance of the particular class and passing the value into the constructor. This is the we have called the constructor here. Okay, and we are passing the value 20. Then that will 20 is passed in I. and print parameterized constructor is called 20. Okay. Oh, sorry, we need to change the execution class. It's the previous class is called. We need to change the path. Okay. We need to set the startup object paracon demo. Okay. Let's save this one and paracon demo. Now this will execute. This is we need to set the startup object. Double click on the property and you get this menu and you set the startup project like this. Okay. Mhm. And explicit constructor is called explicit constructor is called what happened. Mm, here we have set the constructor paracon demo and why it's bothering constructor demo paracon demo. What happened here? Hmm. I will set the path here. This one is called why this one is called. Where do I set the path here? This is creating a problem. I think many times ago I have created this one solution build solution. Okay, at the target path startup of the, then I don't know why this is not working. This is created many times ago. This particular solution, this particular project constructor demo and the demo solution is created many times ago. That's why maybe creating the problem. One second, just check one more time. After that, we'll. One second. It is again calling the previous one. I don't know why it is again and again calling previous one. When I will fix, then video size will be more. So I will fix, and tomorrow we will see all the examples whatever we have learned here. Okay, we will see all the examples tomorrow in next video. We will see. I will upload the continuation part of this video, and I need to cover some more things about the constructor. So in that video, I will cover the example of these things. Okay. Uh, we need to cover the constructor overloading, and here we will cover in the example copy what is copy constructor, static constructor with example, and parameterized constructor, everything I will give the example in next continuation video. And some more things we need to cover in for the constructor overloading, and many more things we will discuss in next video. Okay, thank you. That's all. Thank you.